The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Zulovich, part of the team at Cherokee Media Group and senior editor of Subprime Auto Finance News. In today's webinar, Align Your Systems to Streamline Your Credit Program, we're going to learn more from Karthik Viravalli, who is the Chief Product Officer at DeFi Solutions, and Daniel Perry, the co-founder and CEO of True Decision. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. Please make sure you've dialed in using the phone number provided in your communication email, or you're able to listen via your PC speakers. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll make the recording available to you as soon as possible. We'll be in listen-only mode for this webinar, but we will reserve some time after the presentation for a Q&A session. You can submit your questions at any time through the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if we aren't able to get to your question today, don't worry, because we'll forward it on to the team at DeFi Solutions so they can respond back to you directly via email. And lastly, if you have any difficulty during today's webinar, please click on the hand icon to alert a member of our team. So with plenty of knowledge and recommendations to share, let's get right to Karthik and Daniel for our webinar. Gentlemen, the floor is now yours.
Hello guys, welcome to this webinar. I'm going to kick it off. I'm Karthik Viravalli. I'm the Chief Product Officer at DeFi Solutions. So I think some of you probably heard of DeFi Solutions, but for people who have not, we are a cloud-based lender-centric platform of services for independent and captive finance, as well as banks, credit unions, and buy here, pay here dealers. We started off as a loan origination company, loan origination system, and then we have added more products to our suite of products. So we have a loan management system, an analytics and reporting platform, and a few other products coming down the pipeline. I personally am responsible for the overall product vision and the overall product strategy at DeFi Solutions. Daniel?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Daniel Perry. I spent the last 20 years in senior credit risk positions at a couple companies. I started my career with AmeriCredit in the late 90s, and I was very fortunate that that company had the foresight to invest quite a bit in IT infrastructure, in making systems speak to each other, and then in the credit risk function. So I ultimately was running that entire credit risk function up until we had a $16 billion portfolio and had quite a large team of people, about 60 in our risk team, shredding data all over the company for all kinds of problems that we were trying to optimize. I left that company in 2006 with some partners. We founded Exeter Finance and built it from a startup to between 2 and 3 billion in receivables. I was chief credit officer from that company from our inception until I left in 2014 for some new business ventures. One of those is True Decision. And so the idea with True Decision is there are many companies that are out there that will never have the multi-million-dollar IT infrastructure between 50, 60, 70 people in a risk group shredding data. There are a lot of learnings that came over that 2-decade experience and a lot of tools we developed. And the idea of True Decision is to be able to put the power of those types of analytic solutions in the hands of lenders built by people who understand the lending problem. So that's our background. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Karthik.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So this actually ties back well with whatever Daniel started with. Is the whole idea of this presentation is we wanted to talk about how you can build a great credit program by making sure your systems are in place and then doing certain things that you always have to do to build a good program. So here is a quick table of contents. So we're going to kick it off with some takeaways that you probably have seen in the initial invite, the webinar invite. And we're going to talk through a few items after that and end up with a 10 minutes open Q&A session. So on the takeaways, we are going to learn how to align your originations and servicing system and any systems around that so that you're capturing the right data. We are going to talk about the data storage versus data computation, what's the difference, and what data is important to shred now versus later. And then I'm going to turn over to Daniel in between to talk about the credit programs, how overly complex programs can actually worsen your performance and lead to poor closure rates. So the idea is you simplify that while improving your credit and volume. And then he's also going to talk about how you can build a healthy credit program, and because it's both an art and science, and you've got to do the right things to make sure it's done well. And then we're going to wrap it up with how you actually implement the strong models that you build with good policies around that, so that you can actually optimize both and have a good program in place. Okay, so talking about the systems, connecting systems. So every company obviously have a lot of systems, right? It starts with your origination system probably. In some companies, it starts probably a step before that, like how do you manage your leads, depending on if you're an indirect lender or a direct lender, how are you managing your leads coming in? How are you managing your dealer information? And if you're a direct-to-consumer kind of company, managing your marketing channels and where your actual leads are flowing in. Then you are in your origination system where you're actually doing the originations. And it's important to know how the business logic is being managed in your origination system. Are you in control of your origination system? Do you have a good understanding of your system so that when you want to change a policy, you actually know where to go and change it? Or are you dependent on a couple other teams to actually get it done? Those all matter, because the idea is before you get to actually build a great program, it starts with capturing the right data, making sure you're actually using the right historical data to build a great program. Now, the program could be, and Daniel will talk more about this, it could be like a scoring model that you're building, or it could be like some policies that you're building. Whatever those are, it all starts with data, and then data is coming from your system. So understand your systems very well. Make sure that you know very well your automation rates. So now we work with different lenders who are 100% automated, their originations. Well, they do have some touch points for deal updates, or if they want to like negotiate a particular deal with their buyer, but for the initial decision part, they are 100% automated, right? And we have lenders who are like 10 to 20% automated. So they just send some declines out, some hard declines, with they know that they're outside their policies, and the rest of things they want to take a look. So we have a different variety of lenders that we work with, but you have to make sure that what is your goal. If your goal is to get to a higher automation rate, then are you doing the right things to get there, and are you capturing the right data in the process? And understand if you are like a centralized model versus like a branch model, and how is that different? And if it is a branch model, then are you doing things consistently across it? Because particularly people do make exceptions, and no matter what policies you have, you always let some exceptions go through, right? Because you want to trust your underwriters, and your underwriters, being in the business for a long time, they know what's the right thing to do. But it's okay to have exceptions, but are you actually tracking them, these overrides? And are you making sure that if a particular exception is waived, then you are actually tying it up with the right data behind the scenes? So the idea is you put good systems in place so that you're capturing all your data, and then the data flows into your connecting systems later down the stream, right? So once you book a loan, then it goes to the servicing system. Then at that point, what data are you actually passing from one system to the other system, and how frequently? Now, there are different systems. Like some systems, you board the loan immediately, and you can start your welcome call process and all of those immediately. And there are systems where they only let you do overnight, like in a batch mode. So understand how you're passing your data, and are you tying this data together? It might be the simplest thing, and everybody would probably say, oh yeah, of course you have to tie the data together. But we have seen examples over time that particularly when you are in the transition of either changing systems or acquiring a portfolio, we have seen cases, and I'm sure Daniel can tell you more stories around those, on how if you don't tie that data together, you will be in a much tougher position later on to actually tie them. You have to use some kind of proxy logic to do that. And also understand, like, when you start like putting this data together, then how are you like bringing all that together? In the sense, do you use a reporting metric? How often does your reports update? Is it again like overnight, like the next day you get all the reports? And understand how, or learn or use tools, find out tools. There are definitely tools out there that can make it happen much faster. And eventually we'll talk about what data is important to compute now versus later, but having a good idea of what all data comes from, not only your servicing system, but even like if you do collections and you're using dialer systems, like what data are you capturing that? You pass certain data to these systems, but when that system takes an action on that data, then are you capturing like how many times you made a call, at what time did you make a call to the customer? Because you can use all that data later to build different kind of credit programs. Now, some of them, yes, it will be mostly originations and some performance data, but eventually when you build other models like your behavior model or like a collection model, you might use data from your collection systems and repo systems and things like that. So putting all these systems together and connecting them, you have a complete picture of your overall business. And talking about data, right? So, I mean, obviously, as you grow, your portfolio grows, you're going to have a lot of data footprint that comes from very different systems, right? From your origination system, from your lead source, from your servicing, collection, dialers, all these things. But the idea is when you start capturing that, make sure you capture all the data that you have, because you want to take maximum advantage of it. But you might not want to use all that data today, and that's okay. And that kind of actually, I'm going to skip this, like go to this slide, because this is where we talk about what's the difference between the operational data and analytical data. So I'll give you a good example. So if you want to understand what your approval rates look like, or are you going through your funding queue in the right time, and are you meeting your daily or weekly goals? That's operational data. And you want to parse that data and build reports on it on hourly basis, or even before that. I would say every 15 to 20 minutes, try to aim to have that data. Because if you are looking at whether you're meeting your goals or not, you want that data as soon as possible. And that's the data you want to compute in either real time or near real time as soon as possible. But there is some data that you probably want to compute later. So think of like you want to understand the connection between the loss rate versus say how many times the applicant changes their income. For that, you need to first capture all the data that needs to happen in your origination system, when you might have like 6 or 7 different touch points with the applicant. And let's say out of that, like 3 times the income changed because the dealer had more information. They said they had secondary income that you added to the application, whatever that means. All that data gets captured, but the analysis you want to do to understand the connection between loss rates and how frequent that is, the income is changing, that need not happen overnight. Like that won't change overnight. That's an ad hoc analysis you probably want to do maybe once a quarter, once every 6 months. So there is difference in data that you want to compute near real time versus in an ad hoc basis. So understand that difference, because the data storage is cheap. Today, there are like so many systems out there that you can store really cheap data. Amazon S3 is one thing that we use here internally, where it can store like tons and tons of data, like XMLs. When you get data from your third party, make sure, like if you obviously use probably the bureau, and you might use some other alternative data sources. So let's say you're using 4 sources to make a decision on your application. Make sure you're storing all the response data that comes back from these bureaus and third-party data providers. But you don't need to compute that data. You don't need to parse that or analyze that data in near real time. So you compute only the data that is more operational related in near real time basis. But ad hoc analysis that you do or any analytical exercises that you do, then you start analyzing that data on maybe a daily basis, weekly basis, whatever makes sense. So understand that difference and try to segregate that into different things. And once you have the data, that's when you kind of start building a credit program. So I'll let Daniel take over and talk about his slides here.
Thank you, Karthik. One of the things I want to mention, this wasn't originally part of our agenda on this particular program, but it dovetails into what Karthik was talking about, and that is with your data, you got to store it, you got to have it, and that sounds like a Captain Obvious type of statement. But many lenders I deal with do not. They're using their systems, their loan origination system or their servicing system as a poor man's substitute for a data warehouse. And so guess what happens if you go off of that system at some point in your life? I'm helping a number of clients right now where they use their LOS as their data warehouse and all the credit bureau data and everything they had coming through the door. So if they want to be able to analyze and improve their program, I'm trying to help them, but I'm having to come up with some innovative solutions because their last service provider has all their data. And guess what? Your LOS system, your servicing system provider, they're a software vendor. They don't own your data, you do. And I would just recommend, if you're not getting all of your data off there now, you should start. And the second thing is you should push for SLAs that require indefinitely, if you need to get that data or for a reasonable period of time, even after you stop using the service, to be able to get that data, because it will put you in a position where when you do want to find out what the state of that account was at origination, you're going to spend a lot of money trying to recover that with archives, either from the credit bureaus or other data providers. Just some food for thought there. That was free, by the way. Moving on to the credit program, and streamlining your credit program, and there are a few things you want to do here. And so on this first slide, I'm talking about a basic concept in statistics. People will talk about data science, analytics, data mining. Those are fancy terms for the proper application of the field of statistics. And when you have a credit program, it is in essence a prediction. It's a predictive model. You would not price, let's say you have 3 or 4 tiers. You've got your platinum tier, gold, bronze, balsa wood, or however you want to describe them, but you're applying a price for that tier. You're putting an APR on that customer or charging a discount or both. And when you do that, you have an expectation that you're going to get paid back. You wouldn't knowingly price a loan underwater. And so in essence, you're expecting to make something off of these tiers. So all of your credit rules come up to amount to a predictive model, where there are 2 things you're trying to control with predictive models, and that is bias and variance. And so a bias would be if my scale is off 5 pounds, but it's off 5 pounds in the same direction every time I get on it, it has bias, but low variance. I can work with that. If your boss says you're going to get a bonus that's either going to be $5 or $2 million or some number in between, that's real hard to budget for. So that's a lot of variance. And if you look at this chart here, the more rules you add, the more complexity you have to a program, it increases your bias, meaning you're off the middle of the target. What's the average number I'm trying to hit? The more complexity you add to that, you can shift where you're not hitting the target. The more rules you have, particularly if they're irrelevant or redundant, they increase the variation. So that means you're not only off the center of the target, but you go from a sniper rifle to a sawed-off shotgun. You have just variation all over the place. And so one of the problems with complexity, and I deal with this all the time when I speak to lenders, is that it's a false security blanket. It gives you the illusion that you're solving problems. Number one, I have never been in a lender, whether they're hyper sophisticated or not, or they're a very basic judgmental program, that didn't think their program was a secret sauce. And some lenders have some very well thought out programs. Some people have some very well thought out, reasonable, logical, overly complex programs. At the end of the day, you want it to be reliable. You want it to be the target in the bottom left hand of that screen, of that grid, where you're not getting performance that's flying all over the place, and that you're generally hitting the target you need to hit. So number one, complexity gives you the illusion that you've got something unique. The reason people default, it's a very short list of reasons people default or don't pay their bills. Some of that is contained in the data that we have up front, some of it isn't. But the more complex something is, it gives folks a false sense of security that It is good by virtue of the fact that it's complex. If you ask a seasoned buyer, explain to me how you buy paper, every single rule they come up with, there's going to be 100 caveats to, well, if I see this, then I do it differently. But if I see this other thing, then I'd make this decision, which leads to a lot of overrides in judgmental systems, and it creates more noise, even though you think you're cherry picking the loans. So that false sense of security blanket, think of this. So this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my mentors who's long since passed, but he said, you can have a very sophisticated watch that does not tell time. What happens here is you make your program worse, you worsen your performance by creating more variance, even if you think your rules make sense, and it leads to poor closure rates. Think of this, you've got loan origination system costs, you've got bureau costs, you've got your electronic portal, dealer track, route one or whatever, and then you've got the head count to pay, which is the most expensive portion, that has to review all these applications. Many lenders have a cost per closed deal. If you tallied all the systems, data costs, processing costs, and head count and benefits on that head count, you're spending, $600, $700, $800, $900, $1,000 per closed deal. It doesn't matter if you're spending 100 basis points on funding costs, on operating expense, or that's 100 basis points of credit loss. At the end of the day, it's all the same thing. It comes off the bottom line. So what you want to do is make sure you're getting the maximum benefit of your credit program, but you're not causing a poor closure rate. So your program will make more sense to the dealers. You'll have a high closure rate that leads to more efficiencies and cost savings above and beyond the improvement in your credit performance. So let's go to the next one. So it's the KISS principle is the idea of this presentation, simplify for better results. Now let's go back to what Karthik said. Karthik said you've got to have all this data that you bring in. All the data you have, store it. It's cheap. You don't have to process it all in real time, although I see a lot of folks do that, and it brings their system down to a screeching halt. Those poor efficiencies in the data, that also leads to poor closure rate if it takes you longer to respond to the dealer and your competitors have already given a call back. So that efficiency is not helping. It also increases your time for each save. So again, all that leads to more decision time, which leads to lower closure rate. You want your front end to back end systems to speak to each other. There are many lenders that they're not doing this. A lot are, but there are many who are not linking their front end applications to the actual performance of the loans, which makes it really difficult to test whether your credit rules are helping or hurting you. And so you want to be bringing that data in, linking it to the back end, as Karthik said. Your raw credit data, in order for you to measure something, you've got to transform that. Now, you can hire a bunch of analysts to do that yourself, and there are many that do that. I've done that for many years, hired my own team to do that internally. You can use a third party. I'm not getting paid by any of these folks, but DMS has a fine product that does this. You also have each of the credit bureaus have their suite of what they'll call their expert secret sauce attributes. There's somewhere between 600 and 1,000 attributes on each credit bureau report that you can use to test credit. So you can subscribe to these data sources to append them to your existing data if you haven't shredded that data, or you can create your own, like I said. So what you have to understand, though, when you start doing this, if you start linking performance to each of the rules up front, it's very possible that you'll get that you could get internal resistance, and that comes from a couple of places. If you have tried and true credit rules that are considered sacred cows of sorts with companies, in my prior company there was this, or in my one of my early companies, there's this belief that if good auto credit is everything. If they paid their car, they'll always pay their car. If they default on their auto, they're always going to default on their auto, and that was a conventional thinking, and people accepted it as biblical. Well, the bottom line is they filtered those out, but we still had a 20+% loss rate over the life of a pool. That's not net loss, that's number of accounts at default. So all of those had been vetted for proper credit or proper car credit, but we still had default, so that wasn't enough. When you start testing things that are considered axioms of the business, a couple of things can happen in that, and that you can have internal folks push back on that, and also you can have a lot of pushback in the area. Well, now we're making our program more difficult to explain. So those may or may not be valid reasons, but you have to be prepared for them, because when you change anything, it's likely to create some noise. Going on to your credit program itself, the first thing you have to do is eliminate irrelevant factors. I know in my long experience being involved in credit scoring, you'll start out with 1,000 different things you could say about each account. It's not only the loan structure, it's not only the application factors, but 1,000 plus different measurements of credit, as far as revolving credit, bank credit, installment credit, open credit lines, things like that go in there, collections, public records. At the end of the day, you can have so many things you can say, but they're not all important. And about 60% of that falls out. When you say, let's throw out everything that's not correlated to the outcome, you end up throwing out about 60% of that data. So now you're down to, let's say, 400 attributes. Of the 400, a good 350 of them are completely redundant with each other, and they're not the best predictors. So you start with this preponderance of data. When you boil it down to what matters, it's a substantially smaller group. So in this example, I've taken from our True Decisions credit archives of about 1 million consumer records. We whittled it down to paper that looked just like deep subprime paper, or paper under, let's say, in this example, I've got a program tier where it's just loans between 550 and 559 on the, or 599 on the credit score. So a 50-point range. It's a program tier. Now, this 1 million record sample of generally non-prime paper, right? So it's in a generally below a 650 credit score, above a single-digit APR, within an amount finance. It looks like paper that would be funded. I think I've got a data sample explanation on the bottom right here. But you have about 160,000 records. I want to show you what happens when you have some irrelevant rules on here. Now, each one of these rules may sound important, but they have almost no correlation to the default. So of these 160,000, about 15% or 14.66% defaulted within a 24-month period. That's my whole sample. I've cut it by a credit score. I'm going to add public records. If I'm an underwriter, I might have a credit rule that says I don't want them to have more than 2 or more public records. I'm throwing it out. Well, now you cut your data down to 135,000, but your default rate, it went from 14.66 to 14.61. I would call that noise and no difference. So I don't want 2+ public records. Public records could be liens, they could be other court judgments where a collection went to court, it could be bankruptcy information. The next one is, okay, I also in my credit program, I don't want them to have more than, I said, I don't want there to be any worse than 30 days past due in the last 12 months. Well, that sounds reasonable. You don't want to fund somebody with recent delinquency. What happens with that is it takes my 160,000 records, and with the addition of the other rule, it brings it down to 42,000 records. I've gotten rid of almost 75% of the data, and look what happened to my default rate. My default rate on that sample is 16.19%. Oh, I don't want any deferred student loans, because those student loans might come due and then they won't be able to pay their car loan. Okay, well, it sounds intuitive, right? When I do that, it cuts it down to 35,000 records from the 160, and I've still got a 15% default rate. I don't want to charge off in the last 24 months. That also sounds reasonable. I've cut that down to now 35,483 records. So what I did there by adding these irrelevant rules into my credit program is I threw out 78% of my data, and my loss rate's a little bit worse. So the punchline of this is don't do that. The way you don't do that is you analyze your data and you look at factors in your credit program that add complexity. They throw out applications and they're not helping and could be hurting your program. So if you look at that, I'd be better off to have given an approval on the full 159,000 than I would to throw out most of the data that I've got: bureau costs, LOS costs, headcount costs, electronic portal costs, application portal costs, and I haven't really improved anything. And you only know that if you do what Karthik suggested up front, which is make sure you've got the data and tie it to performance, tie your systems together, and you've got to be able to measure these things. So eliminating irrelevant factors is the first thing. The next thing is eliminating redundant factors. And this is a harder one for people to get their head around because you have rules that individually make a lot of sense. They're correlated with loss, they're highly correlated with default. But if you've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 that are all measuring the same aspect, you don't need all of them. It's redundant, and it's called exploding your variation, or it's creating a lot of noise, right? So each one of the factors that you're looking at on here, I've got a sample of just under 400,000 accounts. You can see total records up at the top, somewhere over 600,000 accounts, I'm sorry. in my data sample of non-prime loans, 622,000. When I look at worst rating on all trades in the past 12 months, so what's the worst performance you've had on any of your trades in the last 12 months? So let's say you've got a 3, or your 2-page sponsor, you've got an 8 or 9, you've got a charge off or a repo. If that's a rule, you have just under a 19% default rate. Number of trades 90 days or more currently past due, that's a 20% default rate. And you can see you've all got, in that example, having that rule, you cut the 622,000 records down to 396. So it's very similar to the first rule. Number of trades 90 days since opening a new trade in the last 24 months, that particular attribute is also highly correlated with default. You have about a 19% default rate for that group. It cuts your data down a little bit more, cuts it down to 245,000 records that pass the rule of the 622. But the problem with this is when you combine all of these together, you are cutting out a substantial portion of the data, and your credit losses will vary. So what we did here is we did a random sample of loans. Let's say you're a lender that is funding 300 loans a month. If I apply all these rules at the same time, they have to pass every single one of these rules. If I do that, and I'm pulling 300 loans a month randomly out of this pool of 600,000 records, I'm getting loss rates over 24 months that vary from 16% to 26%. That's a hard range to price for, having 1,000 basis points of default risk variation. And so again, when you add these things together that are essentially measuring the same factor, you're actually not helping things. You're throwing out a lot of data and you're creating more variation in your performance. So what you want to do in that situation, when you have things that are highly predictive of loss, you want to measure, are they highly correlated with each other? A very simple way to understand this is when you're looking at vehicle value, you can take the wholesale trade value, you can take the number of miles the car has, or for our Canadian friends, number of kilometers, and then you can take the age of the vehicle. All three of those are essentially measuring the same thing. There's a predictable number of miles people put on their car every year. There's a predictable roughly 15% depreciation rate annually for used cars. You're coming up with the same number. They're measuring the same thing. When you combine them all, you throw out a ton of data that you don't need to throw out. You're not making performance better. And you end up creating more noise, more variation in the output of your credit performance just by this unneeded complexity in the program. So, the best practices related to these, there's a number of them. But the first thing is you want to set up a process to routinely evaluate program performance, both to assess redundancy and relevancy. I would add a third thing. With model-driven decisions, the challenge here is that we're going to miss something. And so if we have buyers that are looking at this, they're a safety net. And I would agree with that. Models do a lot of great things. They answer a lot of questions very well, but not questions you didn't ask them. And so there are data sources that you just don't, or there are issues that you want to control from an underwriting perspective that you just don't have good, reliable data on. When I've worked with buyers in the past and we've done analysis or retroactive analysis on how should we improve our models, how should we improve our buying program, I'll get together with them and I'll say the answer is going to be one of three things. So we'll take buyer concerns, put them on a top 10 list, and you'll say these are the outcomes. Every one of these questions that you brought up has one of three answers. One, you're right, I'm wrong. We found something new to measure and stick in the model, and here's the data that shows that works. The other answer is I'm right, you're wrong. You think this is terrible, but this particular credit aspect is terrible, but we run the data, and for some reason these consumers keep paying their bills. I don't know why, but they are. So that's an answer where the concern doesn't validate with reality. And the third thing is, guys, we don't know. And so we've got to go with really tight, really well-controlled policy, a very disciplined exception process to that policy until such time as we have data to optimize it. So that's the first thing. You've got to have a good review program where you bring in the field. You can never discover things that you're not looking for. And so when you take a stats analyst or a risk analyst who may never have bought a loan and may have never have spoken to an F&I manager, you may not have a comfort level with that person setting your credit. Well, that's why you bring all the people that are involved, all the constituencies in on the process, ask the questions, challenge the model, and test it on an ongoing method. For lenders that do auto decisioning, which scares the life out of some folks, but I've been with many lenders where we did it very successfully. You're not marginalizing or discounting the experience of a good buyer. You're confirming it. You're trying to operationalize the best decisions and make sure that everyone has access to them. Now, that doesn't mean auto decisioning doesn't mean you put your portfolio in a boat and you set it adrift and hope it arrives at the destination you'd like it to. What you're doing is, rather than holding up the presses with every deal, having to review it, you have a systematic process post-funding to look at deals and say, are we concerned that the model's missing anything? And you have a process where you can test it and have continuous improvement. Now, the second thing is you shouldn't unwind the benefits of a well-built statistical model. So what I mean by that is, if you have a good model, but your buyers are still overriding it wildly, they're only using it when they agree with it, which is the same thing you have without the model, right? So it's kind of like going and playing blackjack. If you hit on a 14 or don't hit on a 14, whatever your rule is, do it consistently or you'll never get the benefit of the odds. For program elements where there's not good measurement or data available, set strong policies and make sure you're capturing the data so you can measure the effectiveness, as Karthik mentioned before. And then you want to separate default risk from vehicle structure. This is important because they're two separate things. Loan to value has an impact on the probability of default. What a scorecard is, a scorecard deals with the likelihood that a consumer will default. It has nothing to do with the loan structure, the loss severity, what's the LTV, how much cash am I going to lose on the deal or the recovery. It's strictly on will the person pay you or not. And I see a lot of lenders try to mix these things together. Now, I will tell you that LTV does have an impact on the probability of loss. Smart people don't get in really upside down LTVs, and people with naturally low LTVs, they bring something to the table, they have lower odds because they're able to hold on to some equity in one way or another. So that has a marginal impact on credit risk. It has 100% impact on your net loss, the structure of the vehicle. So what I see lenders do is try to mix those two together. They need to be separated. Loan structure should feed into your pricing because you'll lose more the higher that LTV is, but you shouldn't be changing your default risk estimate on the consumer every time you change your LTV, which goes into highly recursive logic. I see this all the time. It will slow down your system. If you're recalculating the default risk based on changing deal factors, you're going to have you're going to add a lot of complexity to the system. It's constantly recalculating, and you don't want to do it, and I'll explain why. Karthik, on the next slide. When you look at this, here you have one of my recent headshots, professional headshots to the left, and then you have Karthik's twin brother on the right, Mr. Clooney. And so which one of these is more impressive? They're both saying, I've been completely faithful to my partner. Well, who really had opportunities and who really didn't? And I use this example to make a point. I'll see lenders with recursive logic, so it's constantly recalculating every time you save or change something with the deal structure. Do the default risk once. What is my through the door default risk of this client? 20% of them will default. Then apply changing LTV factors to your estimate of the net loss, or say, I've got to get a little more pricing with a little bit higher LTV. What I see lenders do is they try to say, well, historically, if you have a low LTV, we have lower defaults. Well, that's the data that you have in your system. You don't have that data at every stage of the deal. So the guy on the left, I might have gotten him to a 100 LTV after 3 dozen iterations of rehash, where the dealer cut some of his gross and gave him more for his trade. But the guy that came to the table with 20% cash down, I can make the other guy look like it with enough rehash and shell game with the deal factors, but he's not the same guy. And so you don't have all the iterative data. You may, but it's not going to help you much. I know from doing studies of this years ago on millions of consumer records, we measured the impact on risk of every time the deal was saved, every time it was updated. And the only thing that came out of millions of records of analysis over about a 6-month period is that the more times it takes you to get that deal across the finish line, the worse the deal is. But when you're recalculating, saying, oh, the LTV's changed, let me change my score on that guy, I don't recommend it, because you got the guy on the left, you don't have the guy on the right. And so the best practice is get your default risk once, and change your pricing and loan structure parameters off of other things after the fact, but don't create complex recursive logic that's constantly recalibrating, because your estimate's not really any good, in my opinion. You're not really helping yourself, and you're slowing your system down.
Cool. So Daniel, I'll wrap this up. So now that you understood how you build a good program, right? The next question always comes down to is like, we use the data that comes from origination, servicing, all that together. We build a good credit program, then how do you implement it? In my past experience, working as a risk manager for a lending company, I think it is equally important to make sure that your strategy around the program and the implementation goes well, as much as actually building the program itself. And there are many little things that you got to be careful, particularly if you use, and I think Daniel talked about it, like you can use your third-party program to build some of your attributes, or you can do it internally as well. And it's more important if you build these attributes, if you have a team of risk analysts who can actually compute what in the risk world they call derived variables or derived attributes. If you do those computed attributes, when you actually implement that in the system, make sure that your real-time system that's actually trying to compute a score for your applicant that's coming in, that attribute should be calculated the same way as you actually use it in building the program itself. If those two things differ, then you are probably not doing apples to apples. You build one program and you implemented a different program without even knowing about it. And we actually have seen a couple of different cases where it happened in my past life and even in the current world, where people don't, like the team that's actually building the score card or the program might not be talking very well with the team that's actually building or implementing this program or building those attributes in your origination system. Now, there are also other techniques that you can use. You can implement a scorecard, but not actually use it, what usually people call as shadow scoring. So your origination system is calculating the score, but it's just being used to make sure that your calculations are right. And you can make sure that your population distribution looks good. So for example, if you expect on the way you build your program, if you're expecting 20% to score between 300 to 400 and another 30% to score between 400 to 600 and so on and so forth, when you actually are shadow scoring in the real world for the first month, for the first 30 days or so, are you getting the same distributions, right? That's called a population distribution report. So you can make sure those distributions look good so that when you actually implement the program or the scorecard, your approval rates or your capture rates suddenly don't shift one way or the other. So there are things that you can do during the implementation that if you do them well, you're doing justice to actually building a great credit program. And it's okay to have overrides on top of it, right? It's okay. Like, even though you build a credit program, I have seen some lenders who particularly want their senior underwriters to make some exceptions, but track them and see if that exception is leading to a higher loss. And if it is, then stop your underwriters from making that override. But you can make that decision only if you're capturing all the data. And when you build this, when you are implementing this program, set your boundaries around them properly. You still need to have your max LTV, max PTI. So within that boundaries, then the scoring program or the credit program that you build can start rank ordering your customers that are coming in, but the boundaries are still important. And the last thing is, once you build this program, once you have it all working, make sure you are tracking and monitoring it. And there are different programs that you can do. There's a population distribution report that I just talked about. There's a characteristic analysis where you can make sure that every characteristic or attribute that you're using in the scorecard, is it the same as today, that the through-the-door population that you're seeing versus your development sample. So you can build these reports, and some of these, particularly some of the monitoring reports that you actually build, and those I consider as operational metrics. So you can have like near real-time reporting of those things to make sure that you're actually, and this is more important when you implement a new program, right? That's when you want to make sure that everything is working properly. So you want to have those reports in place. And once you do this over and over again, that's when it becomes a process. And you know how to collect the right data. You know how to then build a great credit program from some of the tips that Daniel gave. And then you know how to implement it and track it and monitor it. Make it that repeatable process. And that's the, I would consider the secret of success. So that kind of wraps up our presentation. So,
and a great presentation by both Karthik and Daniel. Thank you so much, and we appreciate the questions that have already come into the system. And if you do have questions for either Karthik or Daniel, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll get to those questions here in a moment. But before we do, gentlemen, if you could just kind of circle back and wrap up to some of the main primary 2 to 3 takeaways that you'd like our participants to get on how they can align their systems to streamline the credit program.
Well, Nick, glad you asked that, because we have the slide perfectly done for that. So if we have to do like 3 things that you have to remember from this whole 30-40 minute presentation. So I would say, be in control of your origination and servicing system, understand what's happening and have the freedom to change the logic whenever you want. The second thing, store all your data. The data storage is cheap, but process it as needed. Be smart about your data computation. And then the third thing is implementing that program, the last thing I talked about. It's as important as building a new one. So make sure you're doing the right strategy around your implementation.
And with my piece of it here, once you've got those data elements in place that Karthik mentioned, you want to make sure you're linking your performance data to your app data. You want to be able to test your program rules, all of them, and find out what's going on with them. The second thing is set up a process to review performance at least annually. If you've got a very robust model, particularly scorecard, 3 months of data is not moving the needle, or it wasn't very robust in the first place. So at least annually, you want to be looking at that data, saying, are we missing anything? Bring in your buyers to the process. Bring in some collections leaders to the process. What are you seeing on the back end? And what else could we be testing for to make sure we include in the program? And then the third, make sure your program doesn't have too much complexity, either irrelevant things or redundant things. It's going to increase volatility in your performance. It's going to slow down your system, and it's going to create costly inefficiencies with your dealers. So if you can avoid all of those items, we think you're going to be in pretty good shape.
Our experts for today's webinar, aligning your systems to streamline your credit program, is Karthik Veeravalli, who is the Chief Product Officer at DeFi Solutions, and Daniel Perry, who is the co-founder and CEO of True Decision. And if you have questions for either of these gentlemen, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel here. And gentlemen, one of the first ones to arrive stem from a point you made early on in your presentation. Just questioners asking, what should we do if our loan origination system and our servicing system are not connected? In other words, we can't link the raw data to performance. You could circle back to that point, and how can that finance company proceed?
Well, sure. This is Daniel. I run into that with lenders I work with all the time, where they're trying to get a handle on these things, but they're at a loss. Well, what you typically have, also, if you're pulling the credit bureau, you have your report, you have first and last name, social, you have other sorts of unique identifiers on a particular application, and you certainly should have all of these things in your origination system. So if you're able to capture all of your raw data, and for some folks, it may mean they have to set up a process to extract things from their LOS where they haven't been doing it before. But you ought to be able to make a unique key. This is what I suggest with lenders. We do this for them all the time, is making a unique key out of features on the app or the primary buyer that ought to translate to information that's stored in the vast majority of loan management systems. Additionally, what we help point lenders to all the time are other sources of data. So they may have all their app data, but they don't have the raw credit bureau report, or they only kept some summary attributes. Well, in that case, if they can't get at that raw data, there are data appends that can be done by bureaus and other alternative data providers.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, talking about, like, hopefully you won't even come into that position itself where your data is not connected, but a couple of things you can do upfront so you make sure your data is even more coupled is make sure that, at the least your origination system loan application number is being passed to your servicing system. But as an additional thing, some of the servicing systems that we have seen, including ours, it can actually return that account number that is being created on the servicing side back to the LOS system. That's a good thing to have because now in the origination system, you have the corresponding account number if that application is actually booked and it's a loan. And on the accounting system, you have the origination system app number. So you are coupled from both sides.
Very good, very good. And another question that's come in, gentlemen, certainly applicable to the deep subprime space is when there are multiple applicants and borrowers on a single contract application, just what are some best practices as far as which FICO score is used, the higher one or the lower one? How can streamlining systems take into account when there's multiple applicants and borrowers coming into the system?
Well, one of the challenges lenders have had with that over the years is if you're going off of the primary borrower, dealers will learn to put the co-app up front and put the weaker person in the co-app position. Lenders are typically averaging those scores. The key is there's some lenders that pull multiple bureaus and try to put them together. I think that's a little bit overkill. The bureaus today all have very good coverage and they have very rarely are down. And so you pick the bureau of choice that you prefer, and you're consistent with it. So I've seen it. These are poorly controlled shops, but I've seen shops where a buyer is pulling whatever they need to pull to make it score. So that's obviously a bad practice. They call that bureau surfing. But if you have a disciplined process about when you pull a particular bureau for primary, secondary, you make that decision and you're consistent with it. So just have a consistent process for your bureau data. And then what lenders tend to do is they tend to average the risk of the two applicants together, and that just prevents somebody from leveraging one over the other. It's not the perfect answer, but it's standard practice.
The voice you're hearing, that's Daniel Perry, who is the co-founder and CEO of True Decision, along with Karthik Viravalli, who is the Chief Product Officer at DeFi Solutions. Our experts for today's webinar align your systems to streamline your credit program. And another question that's come in, gentlemen, kind of dovetailing nicely into that last one is capturing exceptions when they are made, whether it's from multiple applicants or any other type of exceptions. How can systems be streamlined in a way that still captures when potential exceptions are made?
Sure, I'll take that. So the first thing you want to make sure is in your origination system, when you're actually building your rules, you want to make sure there's an easy way that I would say it should be a step beyond that. It's every rule that you run in the system should actually be captured somewhere, and you got to know what the result of that particular rule is. So if it's a simple rule like let's say age less than 18, I don't want to make a loan, right? Like let's say you have a rule like that. Even that rule should be stamped somewhere, and the result of that should be stored. Now, again, this goes back to that data where you don't want to analyze this data every time because it's a lot of data, but you need to have it. Your system should be able to store it. Now, particularly when it comes to rules around, let's say, max LTV, I have a policy that I wouldn't do more than 145% LTV for a credit score band of 455 to 500. When I have that rule, you have to make sure, again, in my, what I said is you have the whole rule and your result is stamped. But whenever someone is waiving that particular rule, start tracking who is making that exception. And it will get more complicated sometimes because there are lenders where we have seen like credit authorities, right? So you have role authorities where I'm the underwriter. I am actually making the decision on this application. But when it comes to waiving a particular rule, I don't have the authority to do it. I need to send this application to my supervisor, and they can actually do the exception. So when you have those situations like that, make sure that you're tracking both the things. You're tracking which supervisor is actually waiving that and which underwriter is making the decision. So then it will be up to you that who you want to attribute that particular exception to. Would it to be the supervisor, or would it to be the underwriter? I will leave that decision to each lender based on their business. But once you have that data captured at that very granular level, then you tie it back to your performance. So you know that particular loan which has an exception, you know whether it was defaulted or not, right? And again, the default or the bad definition can change over time, or by each lender. But once you track these performance data for each of this exception, that's when over time you get to know whether that exception should be allowed anymore or not.
That's Karthik Viravali, who is the Chief Product Officer at DeFi Solutions, along with Daniel Perry, the co-founder and CEO of True Decision. And gentlemen, in our closing moments here of our webinar, Align Your Systems to Streamline Your Credit Program, just a reminder that we are recording today's session, so keep watch of a message in your inbox that'll contain a link to the recording as well as the presentation that these experts have shared today. And one of the other questions that's come in, gentlemen, kind of a two-part segment here stemming from some of the points you made during the latter portion of your presentation is again, how can finance companies find out where those redundant factors might be, as well as if they do implement some streamlining processes, that how can they validate that the analysis is accurate? Kind of a two-part kind of seems like, how do we know if what we're implementing is making a difference?
Well, this is Daniel. I'd be happy to take that. Although this is not a product pitch, I'm happy to help you with it. That's the answer number one. However, the general answer to that question is, here's what you really want to do. And you can do this with a product as simple as Microsoft Excel. If you have the data analysis tool pack, you can look at your performance of attributes, the performance level. Let's take one attribute like number of 30-day past due trades and number of 60-day past due trades. If you happen to be measuring both of those things in your data, or you find a way to shred them for each app, you can put them in columns. So when I have I've got application number one, the guy had this level of 30s and this level of 60s. And I've got that for every application. You can use, first of all, you want to correlate that to default. Is that highly correlated to the incidence of default? And then you have factors that are correlated to each other. They call that multicollinearity in modeling. They call it variance inflation is the outcome of that. But what you want to do is you want to find out if you have things that are highly correlated to default and to each other. If you have multiple things that are correlated to each other, you don't need them all. And so what you want to do is you want to simplify that down to which one is the best predictor of those groups. That's the short answer to that. There's a longer stats answer, which is beyond the scope of this call, but that's generally what you're trying to do. Is you can use simple tools like that to find out if things are correlated. Your scorecard analysts or quantitative analysts allow them to use a lot more sophisticated tools than that, but that's essentially what you're trying to find out.
Excellent, excellent. That's Daniel Perry of A True Decision, along with Karthik Viravali of DeFi Solutions. And our closing moments here, gentlemen, if each of you would like to have the last word, just a final thought to leave with our attendees with regard to aligning your system to streamlining your credit program. Karthik, if we could begin with you, and Daniel, we'll let you have the last word.
Sure. Well, I think we have said enough about how you can use your systems. Think about your data and build your programs, track it. But hope you all enjoyed it or took something out of it. It's always, there's a lot of information coming in, but if you have one or two things that you can remember, try to implement them and see if that made a difference.
Absolutely. From my side, I appreciate everybody that joined us. And as lenders move forward, employing best practices, what happens is all of us get more stable credit performance, and we're really quieting all the naysayers that say this industry is on the verge of blowing up, which it isn't. It's a fantastic industry that helps many consumers that need basic transportation. And the better we all do in performance, the more credit's going to be available to those that need it. Thank you, everyone.
That's Karthik Viravali of DeFi Solutions and Daniel Perry of True Decision. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the expert guidance on a complicated topic. Very well done and very much appreciated. And thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you again next time. For all of us at Cherokee Media Group, I'm Nick Zulovich. Thank you again for joining us.